Very hard to believe that this all happened pre-COVID, am I allowed to say that, 2018?
Yeah.
It feels definitely not as long ago. This was a story that sort of played out in Dublin, very chaotic kind of a situation where a woman's body was found. She had been murdered and had been stored in a wardrobe of a apartment.
A bedsit in Ranalagh, basically. It was very, very tragic case, and it generated a lot of publicity, obviously, at the time, because it was so, gruesome, really. But we had this last week, we had an inquest into the death of Keith Lee. Keith Lee had been a chef who'd sort of become involved in the drugs trade in a kind of a middle class, kind of hipster way, maybe, I suppose. And he had been married to a woman called Joanne Ball for 18 years, and they had broken up because of his involvement in the drugs trade, and he had ended up killing her. But we had his inquest this week. He died. He died as a result of suicide in Mountjoy prison. I think just a couple of months after killing his wife.
And of course, what happened was, when the body of Joanne Bell was discovered wrapped in a sleeping bag and stuffed in a wardrobe where it had been for a number of days, when the Gardaí moved in on that bedsit, he ended up injured.
Yes, he
fell out a window or jumped out a window in order to try and escape.
Yes, he jumped out of the third floor window. It's one of these old Georgian houses, kind of in Ranalagh there, at the bottom of Ranalagh, so people would know what they look like. They're 3-story homes. A lot of them probably not so much anymore, but a lot of them were. It really was bedsit land at one stage. And, he jumped out of the window and had spoken about being suicidal. Then when he was found, he'd landed, I think, on a piece of garden furniture and broke both his legs. So there was images of him then, in a wheelchair. But I suppose when after the guards interviewed him and started looking back into the whole situation, there was a slightly more sinister story. During his interviews, Keith Lee had basically said he was off his head on drugs when he killed her. He'd made up a kind of an unlikely story of her attempting to self-harm and how he sort of tried to intervene in that and somehow ended up strangling her. It was a story, I think, that was described as not really making a whole lot of sense. Then he had said he had wrapped her body, I think, in sort of plastic bin liners, and had sat watching television with her and, had been in a confused state. But as you went back into the evidence, you heard how, it was probably, that's a story of chaotic sort of drug use where he sort of described himself as not knowing what he is doing. But in fact, he'd kind of seeded his excuses in that he'd been texting her phone even after killing her.
And he had reported her missing.
Some
days previous before she was found. And when the Gardaí did find her body, I think it was believed she had been 6 days stuffed in the wardrobe, or 6 days dead.
6 days dead. After 3 or 4 days, I think it was, her family had started to go look for her, and they had spoken to Keith Lee, and he had ultimately gone into Store Street Station, I think, and reported her missing. In the build-up to that, he had been texting her phone. I think one of his texts were, they'd broken up, and they'd had this sort of rekindling of the romance. And he had texted her after killing her, "Love you, baby. I haven't been this happy since our world fell apart." Then he got her phone and texted himself saying, "Love you, baby. I feel the same way." So I suppose this was all. It was an obvious attempt to throw the police off the target, in that there'd been phone exchanges, and he could say, "Well, she just went missing. I don't know where she is, but she'd been alive when she left my house." And that
and all the while. So while he was obviously, he was somebody who had, I think she was strangled, was the finding. So, this volatile relationship they had over the years, this on-off relationship, had culminated in him murdering her, storing her body. He was certainly showing that he was able to try and cover his tracks somehow, but he was at the same time stuck with a body in a wardrobe for 6 days, which was going to cause him a problem big time. Yeah. And he obviously didn't have the ability or know how to remove that body. And of course, anybody who knows Ranelagh realises it's one of the busiest areas of the whole city, it is almost a sort of the type of a place that is never quiet. It never sleeps. There's always movement in and out. It's so close to the city centre. And, there's plenty of shops and coffee shops, and deliveries would be coming through the night, etc. So it would be hard to find a moment maybe to sort of bundle a body out of a...
Absolutely. But the guards at the time did seem to believe that he did have a plan that hadn't kind of kicked into action yet. Obviously, what kind of led to the police breaking into the flat that day, maybe they developed suspicions, but also her car was found parked close right outside the flat, basically, and somebody had reported it because saying it looked like it was abandoned, and that had led to probably a warrant and them coming into the house. Keith Lee had been a chef, as I said, but he had been living a double life. And even after he had killed his wife, he had continued to meet up with a woman that he had been having an affair with during this time. So Keith Lee had been caught. I think at the time it was described as being something like £11,000 worth of drugs in a city centre nightclub. He had been dealing cocaine, ketamine, ecstasy to a group of kind of people, a lot of them involved in traditional music and that sort of scene. His chefing had come to an end as a result. He'd fallen further and further into chaos, and after he had been arrested, Joanne had left him. But in her own inquest a number of years ago, her family had described how they believe she was addicted to Keith, is how they described it. That
she kept going back.
That they described it as, they described some of the controlling behaviour that he had of her, even if it wasn't sort of, I think they also said he was kind of a relatively pleasant, sort of mannered person, and the couple had been together for 20 years, but she was the direct opposite to him in terms of she was a very sort of quiet person, loved her dogs, loved hiking, very kind of sort of shy, I think they even described her as. But she couldn't seem to leave him alone. And in the time that he had been seeing her, he'd been carrying on relationships with other women, it was believed. But at some point they'd attempted to reconcile, and they'd spent sort of the weekend that she was killed, they'd spent some time in a travel lodge together, getting back, or at least, rekindling the relationship. But during that time, even on that day, he was continuing to meet another woman that he was also sleeping with. And she described the other woman described during Joanne's initial inquest how he had told her that he had been married but had broken up, and they had continued to see each other. And even the day after he killed Joanne, he had met that woman again, and he had gone out drinking and partying with friends. So
chaotic behaviour. So in the aftermath of the discovery of Joanne's body, his jumping from the window in order to escape, and his arrest, he ended up in a wheelchair in a specially adapted cell for wheelchair users in Mountjoy prison. And as how many, you were talking weeks, where all this chaos happened within a couple of months, really.
Yeah.
He is found dead in the cell in Mountjoy, having taken his own life. Yeah.
And obviously this is what the inquest addresses, not so much the kind of the reasons why it ended up in prison, though obviously that was mentioned. There are a number of suicides every year in our prison system, and people probably can understand how people under those extreme circumstances, being locked up or facing lengthy sentences, can become a suicide risk. So the inquest, I suppose, was trying to address some of the issues surrounding his death. There was a finding, obviously, of suicide. I don't think that's ever in dispute. But the inquest looked at the lead up to his death. It's, in terms of his interactions, because he had interactions with the medical profession. They had judged him to be at risk because he had written what was described as goodbye letters at some point while he was in prison. He'd also been caught, I think, in possession of a knife. So there had been, they had noted that he was at risk.
He was high risk, basically.
And probably a lot of people that are sort of charged with murder are.
Yeah.
So there was, but also he hadn't been talking about suicide in the immediate run up to his being found, and there was some findings that he should have been checked on every 15 minutes, and that hadn't happened in the prison system. We also heard from his family.
Yeah, that was the key point from his family, was that they learned about his death sort of on social media, and that the news was out when they were reading about it, that they had, his mother, I think in particular, said she was absolutely devastated how she learned about it.
Yeah, I mean, and you can understand why. It was actually, I do remember it being on a mainstream newspaper pretty early. Typically, I suppose the news organisations now have, we would certainly hold off on as much as,
until you get the kind of the green light that the family have been informed.
Yeah, exactly.
If it's a relevant story to be running in the first place. But that is the way it works now.
Yeah.
I think Patricia Lee said that she was attending her doctor that morning with her daughter Norma, and they got text messages on their phone expressing their sympathy. That's how they sort of found out how it had happened. But isn't it curious that a guy like Lee, who's described as, we don't really know a huge amount about this couple.
No.
But I'm reflecting on the case of Johnny Creswell in the north of Ireland, the show jumper who was facing trial for murdering Katie Simpson. He had tried to stage her death like a suicide, but had ultimately, an investigation had been launched months after it happened, albeit, but he was he was in the dock basically. First day of the trial had passed, second day of the trial went to open, and the news comes that Johnny Creswell has been found dead. But both, there's a couple of elements that kind of, are familiar there, that coercive control in a relationship, the violence obviously, and then the inability maybe to face the consequences. I wonder, is it a sort of a personality type of those who are, in charge of coercive control relationships, or who are coercively controlling somebody?
Yeah, I mean, I think
they can't face the music. I mean,
Jonathan Cresswell was, during his lifetime, a very violent man. I'm not sure if Keith Lee would have had a history of domestic violence, but certainly in his inquest and in speaking to other people who knew the couple over the years, he was a controlling person, albeit without that level of violence. I think it was in our inquest, for example, it was described how he couldn't drive, but was even controlling of her movements. Also, the infidelity is also a part of that. Even, as he's attempting to reconcile this relationship, and it is still believed that, and the evidence was given during Joanne's inquest, how the other woman in the relationship had phoned up Keith's phone and Joanne had answered, and it is believed that sparked this big dispute that ultimately led to her death. So even in the face of, where he's getting back with his wife, who's married for 18 years, even then he was continuing to deal with this other woman, and that kind of risk-taking.
But he sort of controls her to the very end, doesn't he? He controls how she dies.
He controls how she dies, and even tries to control, even texts from her phone after she's dead. So it's a continuing, this kind of manipulation of circumstances. And even, if somebody, and God be that these things do happen in a moment of passion, somebody kills somebody, this is a different, by doing what he did, it's a different matter.
By doing what he did in the aftermath, and being able to, be in a bedsit for 6 days with the body of somebody who murdered your wife.
Yeah.
And murdered. I mean.
Yeah. And even the excuses given during the Garda interviews, where he effectively blames her and sort of presents himself as some sort of savior, or, and then also presents himself as somebody who's so devastated he couldn't really contact the police, when clearly he was not so devastated that he couldn't go out partying away in the middle of it all.
Now, Patricia Lee also expressed her sort of anger, I'd say, that there was some contents of notes written by her son. This would be a suicide note printed in the media. I do think this is a story that is relevant for, I don't think you can have privacy when you have issues like this, when it's somebody who has been in a controlling relationship, that the relationship has ended up resulting in murder.
Yeah.
The most serious offence that you can commit against another human being. And then, look for complete privacy in that individual's demise themselves. I think it is a story that's in the public interest.
Well, I suppose there's a tension, isn't there, between what they, as his family, would want and would feel they're entitled to. And nobody could say, you're not entitled to feel that way about the media coverage. I think they are entitled to feel whatever way they want and to express themselves. And they did express themselves at the inquest. I suppose the media have a different role in that that's not the only thing that the media have to take into account. The media, when publishing these stories, and you can acknowledge that it's,
there's so many sensitivities around all of it.
There is.
Suicide as well.
Yeah. There is, and you can acknowledge that these things are going to be upsetting for the family, but that can't be the only sole consideration. Like the issue of domestic violence, I mean, we hear it again and again. We've heard it from the Garda Commissioner, we've heard it from the Justice Minister, and all of the groups surrounding it, and the statistics really do back it up that we're facing an epidemic of domestic violence. And that has been one of the constant themes of all areas of the law officials in recent years, and maybe it doesn't get a full attention. So in that,
I think we're kind of coming to a place where we're beginning to start to understand what coercive control is.
Yes,
and how difficult it is for a family knowing a relative is in an abusive relationship, but that they keep going back as an adult into that.
Yeah,
and that must bring up so many emotions. I mean, you feel that you'd be angry with somebody for doing that. You feel you could sort of decide to wash your hands with them. I've done my best. They've made their choices. But actually, it's more than that. This is a really important issue to understand, that coercive control, that control is almost cult-like.
Yeah, and it's not, as I said, it doesn't have to be backed up by the traditional image of a guy beating up his wife when he comes home. It doesn't have to be like that. And these things have to be brought to light. And as you said, for the families of victims of it, the more discussion people can be taught how to speak to victims, because there is a way of speaking to victims that just shuts it down and they won't come back to discuss it, but there is other ways to be open. And we've heard these things over and over again. So the media does have a role, but you can't say the family are wrong to express how they feel. They absolutely are entitled to, and you can certainly understand it 100% on a human level,
I'm ticked off there now.
Well, you're not ticked off, no. No, what I'm saying is there is a tension. And,
they are totally entitled to that way. It's just the way it comes across. It's like as if that's the only concern.
Yeah, I mean, there is a reason he's in the paper, and the reason he's in the paper is because, or he's in the website, is because of his actions. And, there's no getting away with that. It's not a random person isn't picked up and put on the front of the paper. His actions are, they literally made headlines across the world because of their, violent and gruesome nature,
All right. Well, look, we'll leave that at that. It's a pretty sad story all around. And the, the ending of two young lives in such a short space of time, and in such violent circumstances. So thank you, Niall.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.